So somebody just got free advice just now. Yeah, yeah. I have my rapid fire question. I've never tried this. So
Ooh, all right, let's go.
one thing people always get wrong about you.
Always get wrong about me.
Yeah.
That was actually redundancy and resiliency will be the key strategic pillars that your supply chain needs. The need to negotiate the deal. We have geopolitical considerations, language barriers, cultural differences.
Stephanie, welcome to my show, Leadership and Personal Branding. With over 25 years of experience in supply chain, I know you are the best choice in the industry to unlock the power of value chain and inspire action in sustainability, efficiency, and growth despite the ongoing trade wars, tariffs, increased tariffs, and all kinds of disruptions. Everyone watching, stay tuned and hear from Stephanie. So, Stephanie, before we start, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us who you are?
First, thank you so much for having me, Felix. It's just a pleasure to be on your show, and getting caught up with you is always great as well. So, like you said, I'm Stephanie Forbes. I'm the founder of the Forbes Group. We're a bespoke consultancy. We work on really great strategies in the supply chain and values chain spaces. We help businesses transform. We help organizations navigate disruptions like the ones you talked about and others. We optimize strategies and future proof operations. I also do speaking, so I'm an international keynote speaker as well.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. There's a wealth of experience there. And I know with over 25 years of experience, I think our audience, those in supply chain, those in leadership, those in businesses, those in any kind of complex industry area which who
Mhm.
always face disruptions, you have a business model that can help them. And before we go too far, I wanted to ask you about your passion in tell me about horse riding and skiing and how does this and how does this fearless sports makes you or complement you for what you do in terms of strategy and disruption.
It's a great question, Felix. For starters, competing in any sport, really, but for me, working with horses, teaches you a lot of discipline and consistency. You've got to show up the same way every day. You can't just show up on Fridays and expect it to go well. You've got to keep showing up every day. So that consistency and that discipline transcends, from whether it's ski racing or riding horses, translates into the business world in terms of understanding what discipline means, what it takes to work hard and to do hard things. And then as you take that discipline and you translate that into strategic initiatives and other things, because when you're competing in sport, you're always trying to come up with a strategy, right? You're trying to go faster. You're trying to, can I cut this corner? Can I go higher here? What are my options? And so you do translate a lot of those skills around discipline, strategy, and of course execution. You've got to go and deliver, right? Whether you're starting the course at the top of a mountain or you're jumping your first fence on a horse, you've got to go and execute. So there's a lot of great parallels and crossovers that I think are really valuable.
Yeah. And I think one thing that came to my mind about skiing and horse riding, actually, first of all, I've been in Minnesota for since 2008, but there's a few things that I don't try. Skiing or skating or anything ice related because I know I might injure myself, I might break a knee or all those things. There's risk involved. And the
Yeah.
reason I ask you about that is there is an element of adaptability. And in
Mhm.
business, this is critical, especially in supply chain. Okay, so that's, and I know
Yep.
this is your interest. So can you comment on the the importance of adaptability in terms of supply chain based on your experience?
Absolutely. And I think I take it a little bit for granted sometimes because you'll hear me talk about resiliency and other things like that. But adaptability is really a constant, right? So you are constantly adapting to whatever's happening in front of you. So if you want to take the horses, sort of thing, horses are always changing their mind. And so you have to figure out what you're going to do next. The weather, whether you're in Minnesota or up here in Canada, the weather changes, often, and you can get some, crazy cold weather and storms. And so you have to figure out how you're going to navigate that. How you translate that into business is really always making sure that you have some plans, some other plans.
Yeah.
So, you would have heard me call, that out as, redundancy and resiliency, right? So, what is your plan A, B, C, D, and E? And how are you building up, your strategy to make sure that you're very resilient to a variety of different changes?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. I have another question here about Murphy's Law, but I'm going to save it for later. So if anyone
Okay.
is interested to hear about how Stephanie can come up with a strategy that prepare you to even avoid Murphy's Law, I'm sure you are familiar with it, right? Are you?
Yeah, yeah, yes, yeah.
All right. So stay tuned for that question coming up. So my next question, which is basically the foundation of what you do. Tell me, how do you define your personal brand, and what problem does it solve?
So that's a great question. So my personal brand is really around strategy, execution, and like we've just talked about, resilience. So I really focus on making really complex challenges. Often these are global, especially right now. Really simplify them, make them actionable. And then, when we take that out sort of into the keynote space or a workshop or a consulting engagement, my goal is always to leave people with clarity and practical steps so that they can actually take the tools or the things that we've talked about and we can implement those right away in their organization or for themselves. So it becomes really important that it's really actionable, practical, and simple. So when we take a look at that and we break it down into my key themes, we would really say that my brand themes are around like strategic discipline, right? So that's confident, clear decisions in uncertain environments.
Hmm.
It's execution focused. So this isn't just about ideas, it's about results. So really ensuring that whatever it is that we're going to do is actionable, we can implement right away, and we can see what kind of results we're going to get. And that doesn't mean the results are always perfect because we're going to pivot. If we need to pivot, we're going to adapt and take a different direction. But sometimes it's important to get to a fast fail than it is to get to a yes. So it's understanding that speed of execution becomes really, really important. And lastly, like we talked about, resilience and adaptability is cornerstone to my brand. So this is making sure that organizations prepare and adapt, and they move from just barely surviving to thriving in uncertain environments.
Yeah, that's a perfect personal brand focus, strategy, execution, and there was a third one.
Resilience and adaptability.
So there's four.
Well, I kind of stick resilience and adaptability together. I sometimes
Okay.
think that they kind of go hand in hand.
All right. Strategy, execution, resilience, and adaptability. So that brings me to the question I told you to wait for. So Murphy's
Yeah.
law, Murphy's law states that what's meant to go wrong will go wrong, even if you plan 110%. You can never avoid it will happen one
Mhm.
day. But nobody knew COVID was going to happen. Everybody just planned for the best case, and then that happened. So tell me, how do you account for this kind of moment of disruptions, especially in supply chain and leadership?
Absolutely. So, really good question. So, part of where I always start from is I always start from the worst case scenario and work myself backwards. So I think of all the worst things that can possibly happen from, whether it's a conflict, whether it's tariffs and trade embargoes, whether it's, a boat being stuck in a canal somewhere like the
Yeah.
Ever Given in the Suez, right? So there's,
Yeah.
or a natural disaster, fire, flood, pick one, labor disruptions, maybe everyone at the ports are on strike. So there's always something that can happen. And so you take basically a framework of political, economic, legal, environmental, technical, regulatory, and you go, okay, in each of these spaces, what can go wrong? And you think of a worst case scenario and then you plan for it. Because you're right, Murphy's Law, something will always happen. And it is going to happen. So what's your
Hmm.
plan when it does happen? What's your plan B? How are you going to pivot? What does that look like? And in some cases, that's sourcing from a different country. In other cases, that's maybe keeping more inventory on hand than your accountants would like, but you need to be able to keep business continuity going. Maybe
Hmm.
there's different terms you need to negotiate with your client or your um, you know your um, or your suppliers in terms of like what is it that they actually need to do or change in order for you to be a successful organization, because it isn't just one person with all the power. There's a really good example when COVID happened. Actually, there was all the chips that they needed out of Taiwan in order for all the trucks, like Ford, GM, and everything else like that, to be able to build and sell their vehicles. Well, the automakers didn't take a very good partnership approach with the chip manufacturers, and so they lost their priority sequence and they got bumped to the bottom of the pile,
Hmm.
which meant that mostly military applications and other applications came first. So they lost billions of dollars in terms of vehicle sales because they had, huge yards filled with mostly completed vehicles, trucks, and everything else that were just missing all their chips.
Yeah.
So when we look at those types of situations, right? Like, sure, we can maybe plan for COVID, but we didn't plan for the disruption in the manufacturing cycle, and we didn't plan for how that impacted, all the trickle down effects in terms of the tiny little suppliers at the bottom of the food chain, and whether or not they were going to be able to continue to deliver. And so it really sort of touches on our ability to actually have some redundancy in our plans. So making sure that
Hmm.
we have a lot of ability to navigate, pivot, and do other things in
Hmm.
order to keep business moving.
Yeah, and I can see how some leaders might be hesitant to keep long inventory or like over inventory or even cash flow impacts to that kind of planning that is
Yeah.
beyond the normal. And I'm sure you also through your experience you have some type of negotiation or like presented them with an option and convincing
Yeah.
them in a way that they either accept or not accept. And in a case where they don't accept, I'm sure there's some contracting that needs to be signed. So have you run into something like that? And you don't need to mention names or anything, but a situation
Mm-hmm.
where a company accepts the risk and they move on.
Yeah, so I think the most important thing when we're negotiating anything, in my experience, is that you take it from a win-win approach. So there's a lot of different approaches to contract negotiation in general, and the best outcomes are ones where both parties come away with a bit of a win. And so if you approach it from a partnership perspective, if you approach it with, some level of risk sharing, you can always get a deal done. I've been very fortunate in my career. I've been able to close every deal I've ever had to work through, even very difficult deals, even conflict situations where you're in mediation and arbitration. We always get to a deal at the end. It might be a little heavy on one side or the other, but at the
Mhm.
end of the day, approaching it from a partnership, from a win-win perspective, will absolutely get you to where you need to go.
Mhm.
The biggest impact that we have, or the impediment, actually, I meant to say, in negotiation, is our own ego. So if we can set our own ego aside, and if we can really listen to what the other party is saying and
Mhm.
really try and achieve a win-win outcome, you will always get there. It's usually
Yeah.
when ego gets involved that you end up with an impasse, because you've got individuals, you know, coming from a place of ego as a place of understanding and listening. That
Yeah.
remaining, you know, to be curious, like always remain curious and question and, you know, listen. Like if you stay there, you'll always come up with a close to the deal.
Yeah. And I have two things to mention about ego. Somebody once told me that the higher you go in your career as into higher and higher leadership, the toughest thing to manage or to control is one's ego. And you can
Yes.
see how it can apply in supply chain and even disrupt the entire company. The other
Mm-hmm.
one I wanted to talk about here is closing the deal. My last guest in the podcast was focused in sales, and he gave us
Mm-hmm.
some secrets to closing deals by not just focusing on the end outcome, but
Mm-hmm.
focusing on deeper connection in the moment and enjoying the milestone as you go. So that's very true about managing one's ego and taking a path that will most likely close a deal, which is basically connecting on both sides, like you're saying. So
Yeah,
my
that's a
yeah,
very
yeah,
good
go ahead.
advice from your other podcast guest. That's yeah,
Yeah.
that's very true.
So there's a very strong connection with my last guest and you in terms, so he is in sales side. He will be on the front end of sales of where like the people that you might be working with. So
Yeah.
in terms of your personal brand, and I wrote down here, I was gonna ask you just based on how you responded here is you have a strong personal brand around strategy, execution, and resilience slash
Mm-hmm.
adaptability. What's one lesson you learned the hard way in your career based on that?
There's so many lessons.
You
You
can
know, I think,
mention one or two, up to
yeah.
you. Yeah.
So when I first started out, so I was doing my university degree at night, and I was working full time on a really big project. I was on the Aurora project. So at the time, it was one of the largest projects here. You know, Aurora 1 and 2 is about $1 billion. So great, big, huge projects up in the oil sands. And it was really interesting. I learned a lot. But the other thing that I didn't do well is when you're trying to figure out for the first time how to negotiate something or how to
Hmm.
navigate conflict when you're in a really fast-paced environment, is you make a
Yeah.
lot of assumptions. And so
Yeah.
what I had done is I had made a series of assumptions that somebody had or hadn't done something that they were supposed to do, and that wasn't the case. And so I had to walk that back, because it was like, well, no, actually, you know, they didn't do that on purpose. They actually don't know. And then you're
Hmm.
like, okay, well, now how do we fix this? And
Yeah.
so, you know, you had to have a discussion with it was a company. I had a
Hmm.
discussion with the company about, okay, hey, like we missed the boat here. I made a whole bunch of assumptions. You know, you're not doing, you need to do these things. You didn't know that you're supposed to do these things because I made a bunch of assumptions that you just somehow magically would know it. And then we had to get back on the right path. And so at the end of the day, I'm still connected actually with that company and that leader
Yeah.
out of Georgia. And he's a really great guy, but we had some serious assumptions and conflict and stuff to work through.
Yeah.
And I was young, right? Like I was, you know, 6 months into, you know, a full-time job, but you know, I
Yeah.
didn't even have my degree finished yet. Like I didn't know anything, and I'm trying to
Hmm.
figure out how to navigate that forward. But um, it's really around the assumptions. Like just don't assume anything. Like always seek additional clarity would have been what
Yeah.
I really learned out of that, because that was a good one for me.
Yeah, and I think what jumps out from that experience is actually owning up the mistake and transparency and bring it up so that you can come up with a new strategy. And that's why
Mhm.
you're like, it's one of your brand. You bring up the risk to the table and you discuss the options for next step. So I think that's a perfect example for anybody who is just starting up in supply chain or any professional. People make mistakes and they keep it until the issue happens later. That at that time it's tough to recover. So
It
great
is.
example. Yeah, great example. Another one here, maybe along the same line. If you could go back in time to give an advice to your younger self before stepping into leadership, what will you say?
Whew. So yeah, going back and saying like, don't make any assumptions.
Yeah.
Clarify always would have, but that was a really good lesson for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I learned a lot. So I wouldn't actually take that one away. Um, I think it was really valuable. But in terms of guiding my younger self, in terms of what it's like to be in a leadership role, it's really challenging in terms of
Yeah.
not everyone thinks like you, not everyone has the same level of expectations as you. And
Yeah.
so, again, that assumption piece, when you're stepping into a leadership role, is don't assume that individuals that report to you are going to be like you, or are going to approach things similarly to you. Expect that they're going to be quite a bit different than you, and really
Mm-hmm.
seek to understand. So I think from a leadership perspective, especially for new leaders who maybe it's their first time managing others,
Mm-hmm.
again, watching those assumptions around what it is that you think individuals want or need or aspire to, or their belief system is,
Mm-hmm.
really sit down and make sure that you have a good understanding before you try and lead them. Because
Yeah.
we are all very different people.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's a great advice. It ties to your experience, story, and the mistake you made, and I think there's more to learn from that. So those who are listening will actually benefit from that. I saw that you are in the board of you are on the
Mm-hmm.
board in Supply Chain Canada, right?
Yes. So
Yeah.
I'm currently vice chair for Supply Chain Canada West. So that particular group is Alberta and BC, so two of our westernmost provinces. And I work with the national group as well on a regular basis. There's going to be a conference here in Calgary, my hometown, in June of this year, a big national conference. So I sit on the committee that's organizing that conference as well. It's going to be probably one of the premier conferences this year in supply chain in Canada. So it's going to be excellent. We're very much looking forward to it.
Nice. So yeah, that sets me up for my next question. So hopefully you can answer it without getting in trouble. So imagine you have gotten a call from President Trudeau to for advice, for direction on how to react to the new tariffs. And maybe you have to talk to the president of the United States too. What will you advise them in light of the current trade wars and the tariffs ongoing?
Well, and that's a really great question. I what I would advise our Prime Minister Trudeau on is to not be reactionary. That what really is required is cooler heads need to prevail, and actually sit down and have a discussion around like what's really happening here. Because when we start introducing tariffs on both sides, it really impacts our ability to do business. So the GDP of any nation is the efficiency and effectiveness with which goods and services move across borders internally and then across external country borders. And when we start disrupting the free flowing movement of goods and services across borders, we make it really difficult for businesses to do business. And that impacts our GDP, it impacts our all of our numbers, our stats, employment,
Yeah.
disposable income, everything. So my advice to both of them would be to sit down and have a discussion around like what is the issue, what is the concern we're trying to solve, because
Hmm.
the tariffs are a mechanism to solve a problem.
Yeah.
And we don't necessarily, maybe in all cases, understand what the root of the main problem is. And I
Hmm.
think understanding what that looks like would be the first place that I would start,
Yeah.
because a back and forth trade war between, we're one of each other's largest partners, right? So Mexico is the US's number one trading partner. Right behind
Hmm.
it is Canada, and Canada's largest trading partner is the US. So we're really impacting a significant amount of GDP on both sides of the wall.
Hmm.
And in order to navigate that forward, we need to ask more questions and listen.
Yeah.
As somebody once told me, we have two ears and one mouth, which means that we should listen twice as much as we speak.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. Um, Tell me, especially in supply chain, is there such thing as we don't need them? They don't need us? Because that's the discussion now. Canada, we don't need Canada. We need Canada. We don't need US. We need US. Is there such thing as we don't need somebody else in this environment, in this kind of of environment of disruption?
Yeah. So the thing is that the US relies quite heavily on Canada for a lot of goods. So I'm going to just agriculture products and oil and gas, right? So we export the most of that. A lot of it goes to the US. Some of our grain, of course, and everything else like that goes overseas for agriculture products. But it does start to impact an automotive. We have a lot of automotive part manufacturing out east as well. So that's going to start to impact, for example, for your automakers, the price of vehicles, because now you've got these tariffs on these parts, right? You've got tariffs on oil or energy going down to you.
Yeah,
So it's increasing your energy costs and things like that. It's really difficult to find an alternate source of all of these things tomorrow.
yeah, yeah.
6 years from now, sure, no problem. But it takes time to build factories. It takes time to educate and train people. It takes time to shift all of those things.
Hmm.
And certain things, like for example, oil and gas, you might not necessarily be able to produce enough in country to meet all of your demands.
Yeah.
So there becomes a tipping point there where you're just not able to be self-sufficient in all
Hmm.
cases. In some cases, you might be able to, but it's going to take a lot of time. And in the meantime, that disruptive effect of the tariffs and everything else like that is going to just increase costs and or make it prohibitive for certain businesses to continue doing business.
Yeah. And I think this is a perfect moment where there's something going on that might impact supply chain, and you are going to become very valuable to most companies. So now I've asked you about what you will advise the prime minister and the president. How about the leaders of these companies, top leaders of these companies? What immediate advice do you give them to prepare? Because in this case, Murphy's law is predictable. What might happen at this time? So how do you go
Yeah.
about that? Yeah.
So that's a great question. So some of my current advice is okay, let's take a look at all of your vendors that you currently go out and do business with. Where are they located? Is there other vendors located in other geopolitical regions that are comparable? Or is this
Mhm.
like the only person in the whole world that can do the thing? And then what's the plan around, sort of dividing up where you order stuff from? And then also, what's your plan around developing new suppliers? So it isn't just that you keep using the one or two suppliers that you currently have that you might have great relationships with. It's developing new relationships with others in different regions so that you can blend your risk. Because at some point in time, for example, like if it becomes, like there's 80% tariffs on electrical components right out of the US, well, then you're going to go somewhere else for your components. Maybe you go to Korea, maybe you go to China, maybe you go to Mexico, maybe you go somewhere else to get your components. And so it's about trying to really understand what your particular risk profile is for
Yeah.
your organization, and then developing a resiliency plan around how you're going to mitigate all of the potential impacts. And tariffs and trade issues are just one portion.
Hmm.
We've got a lot of conflict that's also occurring in regions where we have a lot of rare earth minerals. So, as an example, like
Yeah.
the DRC, that's a challenging place, but we get a lot of rare earth minerals out of there. Same with the Ukraine. There's a lot of rare earth minerals there. It's a conflict area. So trying to figure out how you're going to get certain things that may be very, very difficult to get to based on conflict is just one, in addition to the tariffs and trade issues and other things like that, that you need to take into consideration.
Yeah. And you spent enough time to come up with a framework that you can actually walk people through this. So tell me about the gains framework, if you remember it, and
Yes.
how your leaders might benefit through that.
So the gains framework is actually it has to do a lot with the governance side of things.
Yeah.
So that's a proprietary governance framework that really helps you with identifying governance issues around fraud and poor behavior within an organization,
Mm-hmm.
which is also, it's something that's very important to deal with, especially in larger organizations. It's not the same framework that I would use necessarily for dealing with disruption,
Okay.
like the tariffs program, the tariffs and trade issues, and even if like a boat got stuck or you have a natural disaster, I would use a bit more of a risk based methodology where you're going through individual items and heat mapping them in terms of like a risk profile, and then coming up with a specific mitigation programs for each of your medium and high risk items. Would be how I would actually handle that. I'd use a different framework, but the gains framework is a very popular one. It's a best in
Okay.
class program around governance and executing in-house audit programs and things like that.
Good. Yeah, I was interested to know more about it because I ran into it when I was looking into your website. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I know I've asked you a similar question like related to supply chain, but I just wanted to maybe clarify with another question. Why is the focus on supply chain and value chain so important for businesses and nations to thrive? Why, especially in a period of disruption? I think if you can clarify more there, that might help the
On
audience
forecast.
watching. Yeah.
Um, Making sure that you have a strategy, right? So if we kind of go back to some of my personal brand pieces, right? That front end strategy, and then having the strategic discipline around executing to your strategy is really important. What I will do sometimes is we'll have a strategy and then something will catch our attention and we'll kind of wander away from our strategy. And then you don't actually know where you're at. It's hard to measure. So staying disciplined with your strategic direction once you've developed your strategy is really important. And then as you execute, you'll get to points where you have a success or you have a failure. Fast fails are really good, which means that you can pivot and you can pick something else, different direction in terms of where you're going to go. But having that ability to foresee sort of where you want to be in 12 months, like how many units do you want to sell? What is that in raw materials? Like, what type of inventory management do we need? What do we need from the sales side? And having all of that fit together so that you're managing your forecast and your sales and your procurement cycles and your operations in a really good rhythm. The worst thing you can have is having them operate as independent silos with limited communication. And that's when you usually end up into big problems. Either you don't have enough inventory, you have too much inventory. Like there's something there that's going to go wrong. And then lastly in there, of course, coming back to that adaptability piece is, making sure that, whatever strategy you come up with as you're executing, you are able to adapt and you are able to pivot reasonably quickly as the markets and conditions change. And if you can't pivot quickly, then you're going to get stuck pretty good, because that's what sort of eats everyone's lunch these days, is if you can't pivot quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. Pivot. Yeah. Yeah, and just to follow up on that, based on what we've learned about the experience with COVID-19 and maybe other type of pandemics, what do you think that most leaders haven't are not doing, even though they should be doing to prepare? What's one advice that they know that they should be doing based on the experience of pandemic, but they're not doing? Any thoughts?
So
Yeah.
yeah, so emergency response planning, coming up with your plan for what you're going to do. You have no power, your server's crashed, your
Mm-hmm.
email's been corrupted, someone's hacked into your Azure cloud environment. Like, what are you going to do? Do you have an emergency response plan? Can your employees continue to do work in these different types of event scenarios? Do you have a paper system? If you lose all your systems, so you can, still issue POs or write physical checks, like, or to pay people. Like, what is your emergency response plan, and
Mm-hmm.
how often do you practice it? So, you should be practicing it at minimum annually with your group. You should have a core group that's responsible for keeping that updated, training individuals, helping people understand where all the stuff is so that they can, sort of effectively launch the emergency response plan if
Yeah.
needed. Um, but it's been going on for a while now. We had well before the pandemic in 2013, we had some major floods here, and at the time there was a lot of server and electrical rooms in the bottom of buildings here, and so those all flooded. So you had tons of buildings without power. Some buildings lost their in-building servers, and it was a really big deal. And then for a few of them, they had actual emergency response plans, and so people went to their emergency response center and got out their binders and figured it out. But a lot didn't, and they really struggled. Like they couldn't even get phone access, right? So they had to get people's personal cell phones because this is back where people still had desk phones, right? And so
Yeah.
when you think about that whole emergency response planning space, it's really important because if you can't buy goods, if you can't pay your vendors, if you can't pay your employees, it's going to be really difficult for you to continue to do business. And the supply chain function is around the movement of goods and services throughout your organization and making sure that things keep moving. All right. And accounting, needs to make sure they get paid, and operations need to make sure that they continue to build or deliver
Yeah.
whatever they're supposed to be doing. So it becomes a real big linchpin, I think, there.
Yeah.
And so that's what I
Yeah.
would recommend.
Yeah, and supply chain, if you think about the effect of it, it can lead to layoffs. If like let's
Yeah.
say GM with the
Mm-hmm.
chip shortage you mentioned, if they're not building for a year, they have to send everybody home until they get the chip. So I can see how there can be a snowball effect on that. So
Yeah.
in the industry, people have made assumptions about you or about your reputation or about how you work with them. What's one thing that you think people get wrong about you? Tough question.
Well, it's a really good question. And I appreciate your giggling. So,
Yeah.
so people make a lot of assumptions. And I think one of the things that I've had to overcome in my career is when I first started out, I was one of the only women in the supply chain space doing what I was doing. So I just had to show up and carry on. And often I would get the comment, "Wow, you're actually really smart." And I would
Yeah.
just smile graciously and say thank you, and then carry on because not that they were making assumptions, but they didn't
Mhm.
necessarily think that I was going to come to the table with a strategy, or I was going to come to the table with some ideas, or a different way to execute. And then
Yeah.
when you show up and you deliver, they're like, "Wow, this actually works out really well." So
Hmm.
I think that was one of my early revelations, which I thought was, you have to just laugh and kind of move forward, or at least that's
Yeah.
how I dealt with it. But I think that dealing with and overcoming those assumptions is also really good
Hmm.
character builder. It really helps you build your character and figure out who it is that you're gonna be and how you're gonna show up.
Yeah. So in the beginning, that is one thing that you've always had to overcome. And now it's the reputation is clear, the brand is clear. Yeah, you are reputable in the industry in that space. So yeah, so you've spoken in global stages. And
Mhm.
what's been the most impactful speaking moment that you can remember?
That's a great question. Comes right to the front of my mind. So in November of 22, I hosted, and curated a supply chain conference here in Calgary called the Supply Chain Excellence Forum. And we had hundreds of people. It was broadcast across the country. And I moderated the full day event, and we had fabulous speakers. And I got to do the opening keynote and everything else. And it was probably the best event that I've personally done. I had the great fortune of being able to organize it, host it, and everything else like that. So that's probably the one that stands out the biggest in my mind.
Yeah, I think that's a good experience. That applies to me too. For some reason, I got a chance to moderate an event at my current company. For the Black History Month, I was able to moderate a panel to talk about the founder of the company I work for. So that was great experience, and the things I'm doing outside of work is what prepared me for that moment. And I think you might
Awesome.
relate to that. The things that you're doing outside of whatever experience you get is what actually
Mhm.
prepares you for the next one. So I can relate
That's
to that
awesome.
feeling. Yeah. So I'll move on to our other question about personal brand. What is your personal brand symbol, and how do you use it
Mhm.
every day in your life?
That's a good question. So I would probably have to say for me, the symbol would be like a compass.
Mm-hmm.
And I consider I've thought about sort of what that would mean and what that would look like. And really, a compass represents direction, precision, adaptability, which is pretty much exactly what I bring to like businesses, leaders, the operational mindset. And I
Mm-hmm.
would think too that, having a symbol like a compass sort of helps remind you that it's not necessarily always about like the goal. It's a lot of it's the journey, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
the compass helps you, navigate your journey. And sure, you do get to your end goal, but I think we get really obsessed a little bit with task completion, and like we only sort of celebrate once it's done. And I
Mm-hmm.
think the compass kind of reminds us a little bit that you're gonna, on this journey to whatever your goal is, you're going to have to adjust. You're going to need a little more clarity as you move through it. You're going to have to adapt, right? So compasses work in any terrain. They're very adaptable.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it does point in multiple directions, right? It just doesn't point north. Sure, it can tell you which is north, but
Yeah.
it helps you navigate in terms of where it is you're trying to go. And then for me, I think probably the biggest piece is that I think a compass for me is more like guidance and clarity, kind of like
Yeah.
that little like angel on your shoulder, kind of like, hey, go left, right? Like
Yeah.
I think it's a little bit more guidance and clarity oriented.
Yeah. I think a compass is a perfect symbol for anybody in crisis, because everybody is looking for an answer. Which
Hmm.
direction should we go? And sometimes the entire nation is looking up to you. An example would be during COVID-19, Dr. Fauci and the government and the CDC, everybody was looking up to them to make a decision on the next COVID-19 rule or regulation. And they like that's perfect for you also. The risk was unknown and they kept implementing one after the other, just move on. So I think a compass is a good example of when we are in crisis, we need to pick a direction and pivot if we are not clear in what we know yet. So that's a
Hmm.
perfect one in an area in a moment of disruption. The other reason also is it gives you, maybe I was going to ask you, I think with a compass, there's moment in your day where you feel like you need redirection. And a
Hmm.
symbol like this can remind you when you think that you are doubting X direction, you reflect back and remember that you need to move the right direction. So, do you have moments like
Hmm.
that in your day when you feel like you need to redirect?
I have that every day. Yeah. So there every day, you'd be going down a rabbit hole, as I like to say, trying to figure out, where you're going, what you're doing. Then you stop for a minute and you're like, is this the right decision?
Yeah.
Am I going down the right path? Am I on the right thing? Am I spending my time wisely here? And sometimes it's, yeah, no, this is good. And sometimes it's no. And
Mhm.
so, it's part of, for me, part of my daily ritual to just kind of do that gut check around what am I working on? Is it providing value? Am I on the right path? Do I need to adjust? And,
Yeah.
sometimes you do. Sometimes you're like, no, this isn't the right thing. I need to drop this and go do this other thing. But for
Mhm.
me, I really find that having that gut check around, where am I at on my journey? Is this the right path? Is this correct for me right now in this situation, given all these events? And we might have to pivot, but that's also the nature of like the supply chain space. Like you
Yeah.
constantly are pivoting, and you're constantly, putting out one fire after another. It's just sort of it's a way it's always been, and I think it's just indicative of the fact that it's such a global integrated network. It's
Mhm.
not free of challenges or other
Yeah.
considerations.
Yeah. So given that's your personal brand symbol, where do you think we are headed? We are headed in with the trade wars and the tariffs and all and everything going on. Where do you think the supply chain is heading in terms of it could be uh, technology in supply chain, or what will be the end outcome of all this?
So I do think technology has a role to play. It's technology is going to be a new tool, right? So it's a fantastic tool. It still needs people, but the
Hmm.
advent of technology in the supply chain space is going to really help move the needle forward. And I think that'll be helpful in terms of identifying alternates for people. So coming up with alternate plans. Technology is going to be very helpful for that. I think that we're probably in for a pretty tumultuous, 6 months. Up here in Canada, we're going to be having a federal election here pretty soon. Um, that's probably within the next few months. So the uh, Trudeau is stepping down, so they're going to be electing. I think they might have elected the new leader. I'm not 100% sure if that happened today or not. I think it was today that was
Hmm.
supposed to happen, but I'm not 100% sure.
Mm.
And so then they're going to, whoever the new leader is, they're going to campaign, and then we're going to have all the other political parties continue on with their campaign for the next Prime Minister of Canada. But it's a realistic expectation that we likely will have three prime ministers this year. And so that signals a lot of uncertainty and a power vacuum. And when there's a
Yeah.
power vacuum and uncertainty, other individuals will fill it. And so I think it's going to be rough for another 6 months,
Yeah.
up here in Canada for sure, until that power vacuum is dealt with. And then after that, I think maybe cooler heads will prevail and it'll settle out. But right now it's very tumultuous, and there's a lot of I call it, it's kind of like a bun fight, right? And people are just
Yeah.
throwing like, because it's like, well, we're not buying your booze anymore. Well, we're gonna tariff this more, and well,
We,
we're gonna
we don't need you.
like,
Yeah.
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 And so it's gonna continue to go back and forth for a little bit until we
Mhm.
get a little semblance of order up here.
That's a very good example of one power coming out of power, one person coming out of power, and there's an existing complex problem going on. So, how do you prepare a company for a leadership exit like that to make sure that the company still thrives in terms of supply chain? In this case, I hope Trudeau is
Mhm.
signing some executive orders that will not be changed by the next guy. But any thoughts?
We don't have, it's not quite that simple up here, but
Yeah.
part of the problem, um, unfortunately, is that there's been a lot of political unrest for a while
Hmm.
now, and Trudeau announced his resignation and the search for a new leader a little late. He really should have done
Oh,
that
yeah.
last year. And so what's happened is that we've had a government that hasn't shown up to do its government work in a really long time. And when you have that, you're not addressing the issues at hand. So
Hmm.
if you take that into like an actual corporate example, if you're going to exit a leader, you need to have a plan and a strategy.
Yeah.
And what happened here with the whole Trudeau thing, there's no plan, there's no strategy. They're just kind of sort of putting it together as they're doing it. We call that building the plane as they're flying it, and it doesn't usually go that well. So what I would do if I was an actual organization and you're going, okay, for whatever reason this isn't working or we need to adjust, you want to have a plan in place in terms of, okay, who are you going out to replace them with? What type of timeline does that look like? How much
Hmm.
overlap is there going to be, or is there going to be like a hot swap? Is it one and done, and then the new person goes in? But you need to ultimately figure out what type of a strategy is going to work for your organization. How quickly do you need to move, and what type of skills do you need to put in that role to put you back where you need to get to? Because ultimately the reason you're making a switch is you have some sort of declining metric that you're not able to meet, is the reason that you're making that change in that leadership spot. And Other times, maybe it's just a personality conflict, but you still need to be able to have a strategy around how you're going to do that replacement.
Yeah, that's a very great advice. I think part of your business, you also do advisory roles, right? Services. So,
Yeah.
so somebody just got free advice just now. Yeah, yeah. I have my rapid fire question. I've never tried this. So
Ooh, all right, let's go.
yeah, some of them are rapid, but some of them is it's okay if you pause and think about it. So
Okay.
biggest myth about leadership
Biggest myth about leadership. Well, that it's all like
in
power and
supply chain,
glory.
in let's say let's focus on supply chain maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, so the higher you go in supply chain roles, I say the more of a janitor you become. So
Hmm.
the more problem solving and cleaning up and fixing that you get to do. So the higher up you go, I call it the more janitorial it becomes. It's
Clean
some
up.
of
Yeah.
the entry levels are a little bit more fun and interesting and special projects, and then you get to some the higher leadership levels, and it's like one problem after another, fire, and like it's just bedlam.
That's a very great analogy. The higher you go, the more janitorial duties you do. And the myth is people think that as you get up, you're actually doing something that you love as you keep going. So that's a great one. One book every business leader should read.
Ooh, that is a really good one. So I am going to have to pick Chris Voss, Never Split the Difference.
Yeah,
It is a really good book. It's probably one of my favorites around negotiation and understanding, like, when you need to sort of set your, like, what is the thing that you have to have, and then
yeah,
negotiate to the thing that you have to have. I think that that's a fantastic book. That would be my
yes.
my go-to
I,
my go-to of the day.
I also recommend it. Yeah, I listened to it on audio. So that was a very great book. Never Split the Difference. I think I think his background is in the hostage situation, and because of
Mhm.
that, he's now advising businesses on how to negotiate. So, okay, next one. Morning routine or a night owl?
Oh, I'm a morning person. So
Right.
yeah, my morning routine is always a yoga first thing.
Yeah. One thing people always get wrong about you.
Always get wrong about me.
Yeah.
That was actually, if anyone's going to call me the wrong name, they call me Jennifer. So I was
Yeah.
introduced at a conference in December, and they're like, "And here we have Jennifer." And I was like, "Well, usually it's Stephanie, but we'll see if this Jennifer has more fun. I don't know."
Yeah.
So yeah, if they're going to get my name wrong, I'm always Jennifer for some reason.
When you said by saying if anybody's gonna call you Jennifer, I thought I was calling you the wrong name the entire time, but just for a second. If you weren't in this industry, what would you be doing
Oh, if I wasn't in supply chain, I'd probably be doing something with horses.
with us? Yeah, yeah, because I saw one of your pictures with that, and the caption is, is it focus or discipline?
Yeah.
So which one is it? Both? Focus and discipline.
You do need both, but you need to discipline to start, and then focus comes second.
Yeah. So Stephanie, how can people find you? I think you have a very great background in supply chain, managing supply chain, advising people, speaking, and there's other services that you provide, including ESG in terms of governance and all that. How can people find you and get to know you more?
Oh, that's great. So easiest way to reach out to me is either through my website, theforbesgroup.ca, or you can find me on LinkedIn and connect with me there.
Yeah, and I know in Forbes Group, your website has a lot of information for anyone to get to know you more. And any advice you want to let people know?
So with when things are really complicated and everyone's all on fire with the whole like tariff thing right now, the best thing that we can do is actually stay calm and try and work through what some solutions might be and listen to what other individuals are saying. It's really easy to get caught up in the hype and get all panicked.
Hmm.
It doesn't actually help you solve problems. The more panicked you become, the least likely you are to solve a problem. So if you can stay
Mhm.
calm and work through the issues and figure out some solutions, not only is it feel better, but you actually come up with some better outcomes. So that would be my advice for everyone.
Yeah, and maybe this is a great segue to one question, one rapid fire question that I forgot to ask you about. I know you have plans to write a book. If
Mhm.
somebody had to write a book about you, what will the title be?
About me.
Now, maybe
Uh,
not about you, but about your work, basically, also.
I don't, that's a really good question. I don't know that I can rapid fire come up with an answer, but the book I am writing
Yeah.
is the value chain playbook. So it's a book all on working through whether it's tactical or strategic procurement, the differences there, how to navigate things like negotiations, inflation, metrics. So, like, be careful what you measure, how to navigate geopolitical and global events. So, that's the one that I'm working on right now. It's going to be a very practical book with a lot of hands on practical guides and solutions to help individuals maybe who are younger in their career or organizations that you want to do a team building session, around a book. That's kind of what it's geared towards, is really practical, actionable insights.
And I think that's a great book that if somebody had to write about your body of work, it will be the value chain playbook, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think this has been a very great conversation, and I
I
know
think you
you.
covered everything, Felix. I would like to say thank you. This has been a great conversation, and I hope we can do it again.
Yeah, thank you. Let's plan again when I have my better camera view. So, but this is fine still. Thank you. We
That's good.
overcame one risk, so
We
we need
did.
a
We
different
did.
camera. Thanks a lot for coming to my show. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.